stand and study and present a lesson from God's Word. Appreciate the elders for the opportunity. Appreciate Jared, who was supposed to speak this morning, changed with me so that I could, supposed to help be out of town tonight. And so I appreciate him and appreciate his willingness to let me do that as well. This morning, we're going to be studying from James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. I'd like to read that to begin with, and we'll go back through it, and then we'll notice a few things concerning that reading. But in James chapter 3, beginning verse 1, it says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships, although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless God, our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, and a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh." So as we go in, I'd like to kind of go back through this. As we look here, I've identified kind of some thoughts of mine or some cues concerning this in red, most time in parentheses here before the verse. But we see here in verse 1 that a simple command, he addresses them, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers." Now, as we study later in this lesson, we'll notice that teachers are needed. When he brings this particular thing, a lot of times when people talk about this verse, they talk about master teachers. When I looked it up in Strong's, and I looked in other things, but this was kind of the simplest, most boiled down way, it said that this word that this comes from has to do with doctor, master, teacher. So not necessarily the same, but we can see that all of these are high-level people. So it seems that, the idea of a public teacher or somebody that's a regular preacher maybe is what's being considered here when he says, "Let not many of you become teachers." So the explanation here, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many things. So James here, being the writer, explains to them and to us about why they should not become this kind of teacher. And then he elaborates even further and he says, "If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." So when he talks about that, interestingly enough, it seems, in other words, if he is able to bridle the tongue, then he would surely be able to bridle his whole body, representing, in my mind, the fact that bridling the tongue is at least as hard as bridling your whole body. And then in verse 3, here he parallels this and to something that would be easily understood. And he says, indeed, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. So where, this example is because if you've ever worked with horses or mules or anything like that, that had a bridle and a bit, you know that things can be controlled that way. And so he's making the point here that, if you let your tongue run loose, it's going to cause you other problems as well. It's going to cause your whole life to go astray as well, or can at least. And then in verse 4, he introduces something else that he draws a parallel here. It says, look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. So I know Byron and others are, do sailboating and things like that, or power boating, and certainly if you don't have that rudder fixed well, if you're not got good control of that, then your whole boat will get away. But if you are able to control things with that rudder, then you don't really have a problem with controlling your boat most of the time. And then verse 5, again a parallel. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. Then he throws in another similar kind of parallel or example. It says, see how great a forest a little fire kindles. All these great fires that you hear about out west, especially the Smoky Mountains a few years ago had one. They started from a single spark. And that's kind of the imagery that James seems to be trying to get across to us here. In verse 6, he speaks here about the destructive power that the tongue has, what it can do if it's left unchecked. It says, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. And lack of control of the tongue can also cause a lot of other problems. It says, the tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. And then he talks about what actually is at the essence of this whole thing. And it says, and it is set on fire by hell. So that's the origin. And then verses 7 and 8, again, a parallel here. It says, for every kind of beast and bird, a reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. So, when it talks about animals, you can tame them. Most all animals, at least to some extent, but he's making the point here that the tongue cannot be tamed. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. And then in verses 9 and 10, it says, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. And then comes a huge reproof for them. It says, my brethren, these things ought not so to be. And then he goes on to add an additional set of comparisons here. And he says, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So the message here seems to be about controlling our tongue, our mouth, our speech, whatever you want to call it. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, it says, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." Let's make the point here as well, though, that, when we're talking about the tongue, we're talking about something that's controlled by the mind. So we are responsible. It's not something, it does seem that the tongue, as opposed to some other parts of the body, we can be impulsive with it a lot quicker sometimes. And so we have that issue that we have to deal with, but it is our mind. When I was thinking about that, it's not necessarily, there's a connection there between the mind and the brain, and the brain sends out the signals to do things. But the mind is ours, and we're the ones that have to control that. So we want to notice, since he's contrasted in this, two different uses, where we bless God with the tongue and where we curse man, we're going to notice, both the proper use of the tongue and only a couple of things. We could have gone on with a lot of things, but I'm going to notice the one that he talked about, and then another one or two, and then I'm going to talk about the improper use of the tongue later on. So obviously the thing here is about blessing God. And a few Wednesdays ago, I talked about something that an elder had related in a Bible class about prayer. And one of the things had to do with adoration, and that is praising God in prayer in that particular instance. But here we're not necessarily talking about just in prayer, but we're talking about blessing God. Bless is to praise, celebrate with praise. Adoration is worship and veneration is great respect and reverence. So these kind of things are what we're talking about here. In Acts chapter 2 and verses 46 through 47, it says, "So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved." So it seems to contrast, at least to me, in this verse. Here these people, simplicity of heart, so they seem to be not simple-minded, but they seem to be of an humble mind, is what I would get from that. And then here they're doing things that are simple or humble, that sort of thing, but then they're praising God, they're lifting him up in their praise toward him. In Psalm 21 and verse 13, it says, "Be exalted, O Lord, in your own strength. We will sing and praise your power." So this is their, different passages in the Psalms about praising God. But here this one is telling us, or at least speaking to God and conveying to us the essence of, he is to be exalted and he is strong. And then it talks about the fact that, we will sing, that's one of the ways that we do praise, but then he specifically says, praise your power. Then in Luke chapter 19 and verse 37, it says, "Then as he was now drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen." So, this was in the Gospels, of course, and we see how that Jesus is speaking of here in chapter 19 and verse 37, and how they were drawing near, and how that these people praised God for the mighty works that they had seen in this particular instance. Then in the 99th Psalm, in verse 5, it says, "Exalt the Lord our God and worship his footstool. He is holy." So here in one of the Psalms, it's talking about exalting God and keeping him in that place that he should be. And then also the last line there talks about the fact that, we need to be doing this in humbleness, it seems to me. Worship at his footstool, the idea of, if you're at his footstool, you're bowing down, kneeling down, whatever. And it talks about the fact that he's holy. About 15 years ago, I was on a trip to Hawaii, and I was able to visit the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. And when you're there, and I'm sure others have been there, I know others have been there, but you're conveyed across the water in a small boat, and you come to the memorial, and you get out, and the famous thing that you see on TV, you get out and you go inside that. And I was struck by the fact that there were some people that it really did not even register with me that these people were being loud or anything, but they were talking at some level that the officials there did not think that showed the proper respect for this memorial and the people that had died during that raid on Pearl Harbor. And so these people were shut down pretty quickly. They understood, or these people conveyed the fact that this is an important thing. Something was done for all of us, Americans, that you should not be showing disrespect toward. And certainly in the Lord's Supper, I think that's something that we need to be very concerned about. And I think things have been said in the past about people, when we're doing that, we need to have our minds centered on what we're doing. We don't need to be whispering and I mean, we're not talking about, sometimes children or whatever will have issues, but we don't need to be showing disrespect. We need to be centered on what we're doing here. And I appreciate still the way that the church here and a few others do the Lord's Supper, where you have actually some time to meditate on the things that are being, what Jesus did for us and that sort of thing. I've been to congregations, and especially since COVID, you get these little things where one side has the fruit of the vine and one side has the bread, and everybody has that. And when it comes time to participate in the Lord's Supper, they pray, they have just a few seconds in some instances, and then they move on to the fruit of the vine, and you don't really have that time to meditate. So I appreciate the fact that the church here still at least takes that time, even if you were using those kind of containers. It seems like to me more time could be allocated for doing what we need to be doing there. It's not just the actual eating and drinking, but the partaking that we're talking about. In Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, it says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles, the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." So we see here the expectation is that we become teachers. This is different, it seems, in James chapter 3, where it seems to be talking about a special level of teacher, someone that's a preacher of the gospel or whatever, not necessarily even somebody like me that's standing in, but we're talking here, obviously, about a responsibility we all have. And here are these people for a long time, or for some time long enough to where they should have been teachers. It seems that they had even forgotten what they needed to know themselves. We want to look a little bit at different ways of our kinds of teaching. I got to thinking about this when ER recently has talked sometimes about handing out the little cards and getting people, inviting them to services, that sort of thing. And, there was a lot of different ways that we can teach people. Certainly inviting them with the card or with a track or something like that is a valuable means. There are different people have different abilities, and I think that we all can develop our abilities to do this. Certainly we have, preachers. Though not everyone needs to be a congregational preacher, they're still needed. I think there's a shortage of them. Certainly if a young man would desire to be a preacher in his adulthood, that's not something I would discourage. And I don't think James chapter 3 and verse 1 is trying to discourage that, but it's just trying to convey the level of responsibility that someone is taking on there. They're still needed. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, it says, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. So again, the idea that preachers are needed, and certainly Paul here was encouraging the young man Timothy in 2 Timothy there to do that sort of thing. But also, when I was thinking about this, there are various reasons that a person might not become a preacher. I remember Brother Sutton had an example. He talked about a man that was a doctor, and apparently was a very eloquent speaker and could do a really good job speaking. And he was asked, I don't know if it was by Brother Sutton or somebody else, about why he did not become a preacher instead of a doctor. And the man's reply was he thought that he would have so many opportunities, when people are waiting on, ill relatives or friends or whatever, then their mind goes to a certain place of maybe more humbleness. Maybe they're more open and receptive to listening. And so he was able to convey his message being a doctor. I thought he'd have more opportunities that way. Parents that teach their children, and even parents that are on top of making sure that their children are doing their daily Bible reading or getting their lessons for Bible class or, whatever the thing might be, I think that's a most valuable lesson, and I know there's a lot of parents in this audience that have done a great job in that, and we certainly appreciate that as well. In Ephesians chapter 4, 6 and verse 4, it says, and you fathers do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. So the latter part of that verse there telling us about training, admonishing, so you're trying to get them to do the right thing. I think it was John Cripps was talking, I think of this often, I think I've talked about it in a sermon before. He talked about his mother, he remembered, had already passed away a long time before, but he remembered growing up that she would stand like at the kitchen sink, doing her work, peeling potatoes or washing the dishes or whatever, and she'd be, talking to her kids about what they need to do about the Bible. And certainly we need to take advantage of our opportunities before our children are grown. In Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6, it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. In 1 John chapter 2, in the first part of verse 1, it says, my little children, these things I write to you that you may not sin. So I'm kind of changing course here a little bit because I've been talking about the tongue, about speaking, about the mouth, that sort of thing. But here I'm going maybe in a little different direction for a short time here about another way that we can teach. John is talking here about him writing to them to convey some things. We can't write by inspiration like John did, of course, but we can write letters of encouragement. Sometimes that's put at a lower level than maybe speaking publicly or going house to house or whatever. But certainly, I think sometimes when you give somebody a thought, they're reading it on their own and, in the privacy of their own home, sometimes that message permeates as well or better than it does in other means. And I'm certainly not trying to say that this is the only way to teach, but it certainly seems to be a good one. Dave Bradford, who is a preacher that I knew, I can remember when I was off at school, instead of the workbooks that we order, he would do his own. And I guess the reason he did it that way, he wanted it a certain way. So he wrote his own workbooks. He'd copy them off and give them out. And I can remember studying out of a couple of those while I was there. And he did a really good job at teaching and that sort of thing. And so, if we don't have the right resources to teach a particular lesson to a group of students or whatever, then I think that's a worthy thing to do for somebody to do, is just to take that on themselves. And certainly some here have done, a similar kind of thing and hand out materials and that sort of thing that we know about. There was a fellow that I met back in the early 80s. I was in a work training class, didn't even know he was a Christian at the time. And toward the end of one of his classes, maybe the last one I ever had with him, he gave somebody a book. And that fellow's name was Willard Conscience. If you look at some of the books that we've studied here, Willard Conscience is a very prominent writer. He's probably written as many books as anybody around, I guess. And he seemed to be a guy that did a lot of different things. When I looked up information about him, he just died about 3 years ago, but he wrote a lot of different stuff and taught, and he did a lot of different jobs. Like I say, he had been over a principal or something. He had been a part-time preacher. He'd done all kind of things. But here this man lived to be 98 years old, but yet he's dead now. And these works still are helping the rest of us. Also, we talked about, the cards, but the tracts and bulletins as well, things. And also, something I was thinking of with the meeting coming up, I remember we used to have a list of people that the church here sent out, like invitations to the meeting. And I'm not sure if we still do that or not, but I know that we as individuals certainly should have our list whenever we're going to have a meeting or something we think that people would be profited by. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16, it says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So, we're to do things that would help to further God's cause as well. We want to turn now toward the other part that we, talked about, blessing God, cursing man, cursing God or man in this instance. And we need to, we want to look at a few things concerning that. In Acts chapter 23, verses 2 through 5, it says, "And the high priest Ananias commanded those, who stood by him, Paul, that is, to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak of a ruler of your people. So, here's a man, the high priest in this instance, it seems, was doing things that were not in keeping with what he should be doing. And Paul sassed him back, so to speak, or rebuked him. But because this man was a man, that set up in an office that God had set up, he kind of was rebuked for that. And Paul took that well, and he backed down and said, I didn't realize this. It seems one of the few times that I can remember that Paul actually had to straighten out something that he did. But I think we can learn from that. We don't need to be doing and saying things toward those people that God has set up. So here I make the point about, in the case of elders of our church, or elders of another church, or government leaders, we Americans, and it can even affect us. We talk about these leaders, and I'm not talking about criticizing some policy that maybe that you disagree with, or even talking about in some cases, an elder in the case of maybe they're upheld in some sin. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about the proper respect that we need to have for people in authority that God has set up, like elders and government leaders. Now, you may say, well, God didn't specifically put that one in, Joe Biden. He didn't specifically put him into office, did he? Well, it talks about he, sets up whomsoever he will. So maybe he put Joe Biden in that place for a reason. We don't see that necessarily. And also, in the case of our elders, we may not agree with something they've done, which may be an issue of opinion. But we can certainly share our opinion, but we don't need to lord over them in case of opinion, something that they have a full right to carry out. So we need to be careful about murmuring and backbiting, which seems to me is just a lighter form of cursing or talking against others, such as our leaders. In Romans, my thing here is messed up, so we'll go to Philippians 2:14 first. It says, do all things without complaining and disputing. So we need to certainly do that. And then in Romans 12 and verse 14 it says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. So even people that do us wrong, we need to have the right kind of attitude toward those people. And we don't need to be complainers. We don't need to be backbiters, murmurers, that sort of thing. The additional thing that I added here besides cursing was concerning lying, deceit, not keeping our word. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9 says, do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds. We talk about different kinds of lying, and I didn't put this verse in here, but I think it's in Revelations 2:9. It talks about, all liars and what their situation would be. And when I think about all liars, I wonder about, when I make a commitment, even a light commitment with somebody, and I don't do that, am I lying? We might quibble about whether or not that's lying or not. It may just be that we weren't able to fulfill something, but we certainly have a responsibility for correcting the impression that we're just not people of our word with people that we've made commitments to, even if it was a light commitment. So I failed to put the verse here. I thought I had that there. But the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. So this is the Revelation passage here. Shall have their part in a lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So let's be careful, because the consequences of us not doing so are immense. One additional thing that I'd like to talk about here, when we think about uses of the tongue, sometimes I think, there are different kind of people. There are people that are reserved. There are people that are outspoken. And when you think about that, when you think about people who are outspoken, their problems tend to be that they speak too quickly sometimes. When they speak too quickly, or when they speak quickly, sometimes that's a good thing, right? But then they can speak too quickly. But I was just making the point that people, even though they're outspoken, sometimes can fail to speak up when they need to. And conversely, people that are reserved, they may not speak up as quickly. The tendency there is that they don't speak up when they need to correct something or to rebuke somebody or reprove somebody, that sort of thing. But those kind of people can also have a problem with speaking too quickly, So we all have the same problems. It's just a matter of proportion, at least in my opinion. Hopefully you've derived some things to think about. We certainly didn't bring out anything new in our lesson today, but if there's anybody here this morning who needs to make correction in your life, if you're a Christian, we'd like to encourage you to do that. Or if there are those here who have been taught by your parents, by your teachers, the first principles of the gospel of Christ, and you need to obey that at this point, we would encourage you to do that as we stand and sing.